I have something.
Okay, all
I
right.
have
Welcome
something.
everybody to High Hole Silver, the Weird Western in Literature and Film. And Ashley Robinson is our instructor today, and y'all all know Ashley, and we all love you, Ashley. But a little bit about her. She has a PhD in 19th century English literature from the University of Arkansas, and her areas of expertise include the Victorian novel, the American West, which we're bringing to you today, gender and popular culture. And when she's not teaching OLLI classes, which we always love, she's running Interrobang, a storytelling marketing firm. And welcome, Ashley. I'm going to turn it over to y'all, and y'all just enjoy everything. And as Ashley said, at the end of this class, we are proposing an outing here at the OLLI office. We have a little patio area that is between our building and the building next door. And it's a nice little area, and we hope that we can get this worked out. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ashley.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. It is so good to see everyone. I am so excited to teach this class. I was looking at all of my old stuff, and I don't think we've done, or I haven't taught a Western class for OLLI since 2013. So it's almost been 10 years at this point, which is interesting because this is actually the subject of my dissertation. So we're constantly kind of like talking about other stuff instead of this, which is fine. And also I think this is going to be a fun change of pace for everybody. So a little bit about the class. We have 3 sessions. So today we're going to do kind of like a background about the West. I'm going to introduce you to the Weird Western. We're going to talk about, your conceptions of the West and how that kind of translates into literature. The next session, we're going to read some short stories. So we're going to read part of a dime novel about Buffalo Bill. We're going to read 2 more short stories, one of which is one of the very first kind of like weird Western stories published, or that's considered part of the genre. And then another is by Ken Liu, and he wrote one of the short stories we read in our last class about that the movie Arrival was based on. So he also has a weird Western that's very interesting. And then we're going to watch an episode of The Twilight Zone, available for free online. And then for the 3rd class, we have a little bit of a choose your own adventure, which seems perfect for this particular course. So right now, I have us reading a novel by Emma Bull called Territory. It's a weird Western, but I'm reading quite a few more at the moment to see if there's something that's maybe like a little more fun and a little, shorter for everybody. But also, I would like us all to watch a movie and talk about it, but I could not decide. This has been a real back and forth. So we will talk about this at the end of our class today. And then you don't have to vote out loud, but you can email me your vote and we will pick one film to watch together. And don't worry, I will put that in our class folder that you'll be able to watch it. And again, the goal is for you guys to not have to buy anything to take this class. So that's going to be our class format. But right now, I thought we might go around and kind of introduce ourselves to each other because I see some new faces. And what I would love to hear is either your favorite Western, why you're interested in Westerns, or, just like your interest in signing up for the class. And I will start. So my name's Ashley. I now live in Arkansas, obviously, but I'm originally from El Paso, Texas. So I was born and raised in the West. And things you didn't know about me: I was a semi-professional barrel racer in high school. That's how I earned money to pay for college. I have like a belt buckle. I have like a box full of ribbons at home. I won a saddle. Anyway, so I kind of grew up in the West. And so when I went to grad school, I was really interested in, how that particular culture reflected in literature, but also I love monsters. So I had to figure out a way to marry the two. And luckily for me, the American West was opening and creating itself in the 19th century, which is also sort of when the height of Gothic fiction. So it was perfect. I just smushed the two together and I went with it. So I'm excited to teach this class to you because a lot of us, or we often think of the Western as kind of an old thing, right? Like my grandpa loved Westerns, Gunsmoke, whole nine yards. But the truth is that the Western continues to live on. And the Western is one of the only true American genres that we have. Like it was developed in the US and it remains inextricably West American, even when you take it and dump it somewhere else, right? Like if you guys have seen spaghetti Westerns from Italy or there are red Westerns out of Russia, even when you take cowboys and you put them somewhere else, they still remain American in some fundamental way. And so the West, it turns out, is critical. Understanding the West and understanding Westerns is critical to understanding American culture and how we think about ourselves, right? We cannot separate it from the West. These two things are inextricably linked. And as long as that continues to be the core of American identity, we're going to continue to have Westerns, but they might not look like your dad's Louis L'Amour, Hi-Ho Silver, bandits and cowboys kind of thing. And I'm excited to show you how the Western has changed. So that is why I'm teaching the class. Now we can kind of go around. Let's see. I'm just going to call on people. Sorry for everybody's anxiety. But Jane, do you want to go first?
Sure.
And also, we lost Jesse.
Oh, no. Well, I'll go ahead and talk and then I'll poke my head around. He knows about me, so he doesn't hear me. Although I don't think we've ever talked about what Westerns we liked. The books I read as a child were Red Rider books. I don't know if you even heard of them. It's a long time ago. I loved Red Rider books. Mostly I saw my Westerns on TV or in the movies. So that would be Hopalong Cassidy. It's a long time ago. Roy Rogers, the Lone Ranger, of course. That was where I thought he came in here. Let me see. Okay, that's all I have to say. I'm going to check on him.
Okay, sounds good.
We may be sharing a computer.
That is fine with us. Thank you so much, Jane. Georgina, do you want to go next in your fabulous hat?
Well, my fabulous hat that I just acquired at TJ Maxx of all places. I was born and raised in Arkansas. I have relatives in Texas, but Dallas is about the extent of. I've been further south in Texas. I've been to San Antonio and Houston and Galveston, but doesn't wiggle its ears at me very hard. I lived in Oregon for 2 years, and I have been in Idaho and Kansas and various other western states. But basically, I'm an Arkansan, not a Westerner.
Well, Arkansas was the West for a long time.
Everything was the West at one point. Moving out. But, when I think of when I was growing up, due to the deficiencies of the Fayetteville Library at the time, I read a lot of Zane Grey.
Yeah, Riders of the Purple Sage, right?
Oh, yes, the whole long list, the Mysterious Riders, the whole 9 yards. And in movies, I think probably the stereotypical movie is Red River with John Wayne and the cattle drive. I also really like Unforgiven with Clint Eastwood, which is much more modern. And of course, how can you pass up Yellowstone?
Yes, I think right now it's like the most popular show on TV.
Yes,
we're like one of the most popular shows on TV. I've watched the first, I think we're in the middle of season 3 right now.
I'm hanging up.
Oh,
sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm going to mute you though. Anyway, I'm in the middle of season 3. I'm fascinated by Yellowstone. I am enjoying it, and I also cannot make heads or tails of it, and I kind of love that. Like I
Well,
think it's great.
if they lose the daughter who is the total bitch, it's going to be a great loss.
Yes. May we all be more like Beth.
Yes.
I do love Beth. Yeah, and actually, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Georgina.
You know, I also know enough American history. I've taught American Indian Wars, and so I have some knowledge of the West from being a historian too.
Which is amazing. I think one of the things that's fascinating, and you brought this up, Georgina, is that everywhere was the West at some point, right? And
Yeah.
that is something that we can hold to heart, because if you were to sit here and ask everyone in this room where the West is, everyone would probably have a different response, right? Is it Texas? Is it Kansas? Is it Montana? Is it California? Right? Like that's as far west, or is it Hawaii? Right? You go even further and you're in Hawaii. And the thing is, the thing that makes the West interesting, and we'll talk about this in class, is what once was a territory is now a myth. So when we talk about the West, we're not just talking about barbed wire and tumbleweeds, we're talking about an idea. Or even you could even think of it as an identity, right? And so it shifts around. It's almost like anything can be the West if it fits a particular parameter. So, yeah. Anyway, Georgina, thank you so much. And if you guys haven't gone to, well, I don't know, is the Marshall's Museum open in Fort Smith now?
Not yet, I don't think.
Still
It's
not?
going to open soon.
I hope so, because that will be really interesting to go and check out, just by virtue of the fact that Fort Smith was the sort of like as far east as you could get in the United States before you entered the Indian territories in Oklahoma. So it really was the passageway to the West at one point. The hanging judge was there. If you are familiar with True Grit,
Yes.
Bell Star.
iconic. Yep, exactly. Iconic American novel and Arkansas novel. So, but that's for another day. Judith.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? It's nice to meet you.
Good. I have to echo my favorite author when I was growing up was also Zane Grey, who I remember, if I remember correctly, was born in Ohio, and I don't think he ever lived in the West. But yes, I love Zane Grey. And when I was about 12, all the kids in my neighborhood would get together on Saturday afternoon and go to the matinee. And I think it cost us about a quarter. And there were two groups of kids. There was the Roy Rogers, Dale Evans group, and there was the Tom Mix group. And it seemed like all the boys liked Tom Mix and all the girls liked Roy Rogers. But that's what I remember growing up, and I developed a lifelong love of horses, and I still do. But yeah, it's definitely shaped my life in many ways. Those early movies, and yes, I love Yellowstone.
Lots of Yellowstone fans. I wish it would be interesting to watch it together, but it's so long, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just so long. But one of the things that you mentioned, Judith, and everybody has mentioned so far, is how much Westerns figured into our childhoods, right? A lot of the stuff when you're an American, a lot of the stuff you read and you see as a kid are Westerns, right? And that's incredible. That's so interesting because as you get older, the media changes, right? Like they start to fall off a little bit. These days people argue that like if you want to win an Oscar, you should make a Western. So you get like one or two prestige Westerns a year, like No Country for Old Men or Brokeback Mountain, right? That kind of thing. But for the most part, Westerns in the 50s went from being everywhere. Like you couldn't get away from a Western, right? Every time you turned your channel knob, there was a Western. You flipped on your radio, there was a Western. There's just Western. All the movies were Westerns. But the golden age of the Western is over, maybe, right? But it's interesting to think about, even with that said and done, how many of the stories that we grew up with are Westerns, no matter what. I think that's a great point to bring up. Yeah, Jane.
I didn't think to mention that the most important and frequent game that I played in first grade,
Cowboys and Indians.
specifically remember, was Cowboys and Indians. And it was a little, sometimes I was sort of like Dale Evans, and I had a little red cowgirl skirt and 2 guns.
Yep.
Yeah.
But most of the time I was an Indian and I won.
I love that so much. And then for my generation, one of the games that we played, a computer game, was Oregon Trail. Like I distinctly remember that it's a computer game where your job is to make it through the Oregon Trail without dying. And like your ox can get dysentery, lots of people die of snake bite. It's like almost impossible. But the goal, it's an educational game. The goal is to like teach you about the Oregon Trail as you go along. So like we played it as a class. But I distinctly remember thinking like, how hard could it possibly have been to get to the West? And it turns out really, really, really hard. Right?
Especially if you had to go through the Donner Pass.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, the Donner Party. There's this amazing book by, I think it's out of print now, by a Southern author named Doris Betts called The Sharp Teeth of Love. And it is about the Donner Party.
Hmm.
I really loved it when I was in school, which tells you something about me. Yeah, but the Donner Party, for those of you who don't know, where it was a group of people who were trying to make it out west. They got stuck in the Donner Mountain Pass in the winter, and they ended up having to eat each other to survive. You know, normal stuff. But yeah, the West is full of those stories, right? Like kind of gruesome, almost always violent, and transformative, right? Yeah, Georgina.
I have a weird thing. In
Yeah.
the 50s, you had to aim your TV antenna toward Tulsa to get any reception.
Mhm.
And on Saturday afternoon, they ran this, 2 or 3 hour show of old cowboy movies from the 20s and 30s. So I've seen old Ken Maynard movies and old Tom Mix movies and just every sort of ancient and old movie that existed.
I love that. Sometimes you can still get those old movies over the air. Like there used to be like a Western channel that you could get over the air. And they're great. A lot of them are not good, but they're still
No.
fun.
There is a
There's still-
Western channel that my husband watches a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Derry, do you want to go ahead and go and introduce
Okay,
yourself?
sure. Okay, I'm Daria Wineland, and I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, then moved to Arkansas, where I was raised. My family, my parents are from Seminole, Oklahoma. So there's always been a myth in the family that we might have some Indian blood, but oh, we may not, the hush hush, the skeleton in the closet. So I don't know about that. But my dad said that his mom was one of the first ones in the Conestoga wagons that were in that land rush to go to Oklahoma. And so I think that's quite exciting, a little bit of my heritage. And so one of my first trips out of Arkansas was with my dad's sister, and we went to Oklahoma. And there must have been, I don't know, some kind of a show or something. And they had a little pony, and they would have people get up and ride it. And I was like 10 years old, and my mom said my first word was horse. I've always loved horses. So I got on the horse, and I remember I wrote this in my little diary. The man said I was a real cowgirl. So I said, oh man, you got to get me a horse, Mom. You got to get me a horse. And when I got back, this aunt's husband, my uncle, he bought me a horse. And I couldn't believe it. He called me on the phone and said, Daria, you want to go out and see your horse? And I looked at my mom. I said, Uncle Doc's got me a horse. And she said, yeah, I know. Like, oh my God, what are we going to do now? But so I've always ridden. But it wasn't until I was married and my then husband bought me a barrel racing horse. Never did that before in my life. And so one of the teachers I worked with in Fayetteville, she was a barrel racer. So she kind of walked me through the ropes. And the first time, this horse, his name was Gainsburger. Now, those of you who are of a certain age, you know, that was a dog food. So every time they introduced me, they said, now, folks, don't laugh. This is a pretty good horse, that kind of thing. But, to go around those barrels, I mean, I loved it. And I had a friend in Tennessee, and when I did that over there, she would yell, she's a mother of 2 little boys, clap for her. Just this crazy. But I've always loved anything in the West. And I don't know, maybe that's why John and I get along so well, because he loves Western too. So, oh, and books. I love Black Beauty, the Black Stallion, the Black Beauty Returns, all those. And TV, I used to watch My Friend Flicka. Was it, there was a black horse. What was his name? Oh, I can't remember.
National Velvet. Are you thinking National Velvet?
Well, National Velvet, yeah, I like that partly because it was English too, But they don't race in derbies, they race in derbies.
That's true. I will say, as a former barrel racer myself, sometimes I think about what I did as a child with no helmet. Like, it's amazing. It's amazing my head is still attached to my shoulders, to be completely honest. I have like divots all up and down my tibias because this was before you ran, as you know, before you ran in shin guards, and all of those barrels, for anyone who hasn't been to the rodeo lately, they're oil drums. And now they put pads on them. But back in the day, they didn't. So if you knocked into a barrel, you're going, like probably about 25, 30 miles an hour. And it's just your shin connecting with the barrel. So I did one race, and I used to ride other people's horses for money. So I would help them win so that they could sell their horse for more cash. But I did the race, and I hit a barrel, and I like stood it back up so I wouldn't lose any time. And as I was running back, I was like, I cannot feel my leg. This is very strange. So when I get to the end, my entire jean is just red with blood because I had hit it so hard that I had numbed my leg I poured blood out of my boot. This is just like, I know. Anyway.
Well, and the object is to get as close to the barrel as you can without knocking it over.
Because you go faster. So anyway, we will have to catch up and swap stories, because I'm sure you have a bunch of them too, which I love that. I love that so much. And one of the things you mentioned is the land run. We're going to talk about that today. The land run is critical, right, to Western lore. But you also mentioned having Native American blood. And one of the things that we will talk about with the American West is who gets to be the hero and who doesn't, right? Like, it's very specific about who gets to be the rootin' tootin' gunslinger that saves the town and who's the villain, especially because historically speaking, right, we think of America going into the West and taking it over, but there were already people there, right? Like, and that is a critical, the myth of the West is as important for what it contains as for what it doesn't, right? And as critical thinkers and smart, all of you are incredibly smart and nuanced and thoughtful people. As we go through this class, I'm sure you're going to start to notice some things. And that's good. Like, we should question it. And one of the things that the Weird West does is it starts to make space for all of the things that the myth has historically ignored. So the Weird West gives voice, depending on the text, depending on the author, to like Native Americans, to women, to Chinese immigrants, right, who built the railroads, amongst other things. Georgina.
3 great grandparents ago, I'm Choctaw.
That's amazing. That is amazing. I think
It barely shows on DNA though, because years ago.
that I think that's great. I think my husband's family has some Cherokee, maybe. I can't remember. His great uncle was a chuck wagon racer, though, which I thought was pretty great. Okay, Carolyn, do you want to go? Oh, you're muted. Hold on, I can help you out.
No. Oh,
You're muted.
She's
What's
looking for it.
happening?
there we go. You got it.
No, I
No.
still can't hear you, Carolyn. I tell you what, if you want to work on it, Penny, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Penny Davis, and I grew up in Joplin, Missouri, and I didn't really read westerns as a child. I read all the, like Nancy Drew and all the mystery things and things like that. But I did grow up watching Gunsmoke on TV weekly. The family watching Gunsmoke, and that is a quintessential classic Western TV show. But I personally, as an adult, I always watched Bonanza. And when I first got married, that's what I would.
Yep, Carolyn, we got you.
Okay,
That's
I was
what-
just testing my microphone and it worked, so I don't know, maybe it was frozen or something.
Oh, you're fine. You're
Okay,
fine.
Anyway,
Penny?
I would do my ironing whenever I had to. I'd watch Bonanza and do my ironing, so I thought that was really fun. But as far as a book, I liked Lonesome Dove. I thought that was good, but then I like all Larry McMurtry books. But anyway, I also like Yellowstone, and I don't know if any of you have seen the prequel to Yellowstone 1870, but if you want to see a realistic adaptation of what it would be like to go cross country to California in a wagon train, man, this sucker is realistic. It's brutal. I mean, it is something to watch. Sometimes I was just like, oh my gosh, closing my eyes. But I sometimes think of the West as more of a frame of mind, like basically East versus West. Like the West is more, the people are more independent, more self-sufficient, and the East is more intellectual because they had a better, they were settled a lot earlier than the West was. But so I think that's one thing that's going to differentiate literature from as a Western is the state of independence. But other than that, I've got nothing else to add. So move on to someone else.
Penny, you're exactly right, though. There is definitely a dichotomy of East versus West, right? In the United States, but also globally, right? There's
Yes.
a reason that we refer to the sort of European American alliance as the West.
Mhm.
It's both geographic and also ideologically not an accident, right?
Mhm.
And for the reasons, Penny, that you mentioned, the idea of being independent, self-sufficient, strong, ingenuitive, all of those ideas are bundled in that concept as well. And what we as we go through class and we look at the ways that the Western translates out of America, it'll be interesting to think about that dichotomy going forward. I think that's a very smart observation to bring up. So thank you so much, Penny. Carolyn, you want to go?
Okay.
There you are.
Yes. Yeah, I was not muted in the beginning, and then someone muted me. But anyway, I'm not muted now. I'm Carolyn DeHady. I was born and raised in Little Rock. We got the first television on our block, and we watched Snow from Memphis, and every now and then shows would come through, and they were almost always Westerns. All I really remember watching as a child was Westerns like Gunsmoke and Maverick and Zorro and The Lone Ranger, you name it. There was very little else. And I feel like I suffered from overexposure to Westerns, and I started hating them. And I just quit watching television until Westerns went away and they started showing something else. And I never read Western books because I got more than enough of that on television and in movies. Until eventually I read True Grit. And I think that is one of my all-time favorite novels, not just Western novels, but it's a wonderful novel. And I liked both movies a lot too. And I recently finished watching Yellowstone. I made it through the end of season 4. It took me a while though, because I had to take frequent breaks. It is kind of violent, you know, it's a little bit like Game of Thrones comes to Montana. But I finished it last week, and I'm looking forward to the prequels and season 5. Now I'm no longer averse to reading Western novels. Otherwise, I wouldn't have taken this class. So I'm able to read and watch Westerns again.
I think there's something to be said about burnout just in general, right? On the Western genre. There's a reason it peaked and it went away. I think, you know, a lot of classic Westerns are real kind of pat America on the back kind of stories, right? They're like, we're the best. Here are all of our American values. Anyone who doesn't have our American values, we go pew, 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 and we have our like shootout or what have you. And as the country changed, right, as we started facing down civil rights, as we were in Vietnam, as, you know, the women's lib movement picked up and it started to become apparent that America wasn't without fault, the Western that glorified an imagined American past, right? An idealized American past fell away, at least in one particular iteration, right? In the 70s and 80s is when you start seeing the gritty Western pop up. So more Clint Eastwood, right? Less John Wayne, more anti-hero. Maybe he's good, maybe he's not so good. And that reflected America's own, as a culture, our own ambivalence to what we were doing around the world. And so whenever the West changes, we can always see it as a reflection of the things that Americans are interested in, worried about, and ways that we see ourselves, right? And it's really interesting. Anyway, I'm glad you brought that up, Carolyn, because for a long time I felt like you. I grew up in El Paso. You couldn't throw a stone for hitting like a cowboy walking down the street. And it got old. It got really old, even when I was like working a ranch, right? I was like, there's a while where I just wore like t-shirts and torn jeans to work all the time because I just like couldn't put on a cowboy hat. I was like, no, I'm done with it. But I think after I had a break in college and coming back to it, I had a new appreciation for it. But also, I'll point out, like, I haven't taught a Western in a decade. So that says something. I feel you, I guess is what I'm saying, right? It's a very unique genre and it is nice to step away from it as well. So good to have you, Carolyn. And Jesse, do you want to bring up the rear?
Yeah. I'm just thinking about my experience with Westerns. Of course, mine started before most of yours. And so my experience early on was radio and the Lone Ranger. Out of the west come the thundering hoofbeats of the great horse Silver. The Lone Ranger rides again. And then the William Tell Overture, you know. That's just part of my blood anymore because I had so much of it as a kid. I tended to not read Westerns. I've read more of the sea genre stuff, you know, Captain Hornblower and things like that. But I think the observations about the West are accurate. You know, we've tried to cover our sins by creating a myth about this marvelous person or persons that grew up in the West. The whole idea of the rugged individual and being able to persevere are all part of our myth, which we really want to promote because we've got to cover up those awful things that we did in Gold Quest. You know, whether it's the massacre at Sand Creek or so many of the other terrible things that we did to the Native Americans who were the people who lived here, and we just came in and took over. So
Horrible.
yeah, and that's, I think that a recognition of the real West has to give us pause.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's interesting that you bring that up, Jesse, because a lot of the things that we love about the West and are integral to the West, like the land run happens because we take the territory back from the Native Americans that we had ceded to them as part of a sort of like, as a treaty, a relocation treaty, right? We're like, you can have these 2 million acres. And they were like, just kidding. This is public land and we're going to just give it away for free, right? And there's a long history of celebrating these things that quote unquote built America and not recognizing the ways that it harmed America or harmed people who were here before and have created this kind of dark history. For people who, for any of you who are in the American Ghost Story class, and even if you weren't, you know, a lot of American ghost stories have to do with Indian burial grounds, right? It's like, my house is built on an Indian burial ground. And part of the reason that is a common ghost story in the US is because it gives us a safe way to confront the terrible things that we did in the past without having to take ownership for it, right? It's like, oh, you know, here's burial ground. We built on top of it. Ooh, so spooky. And it kind of downplays the actual horror of what we did. And so over the course of this class, it'll be interesting to talk about, again, the ways in which the myth is really a two-sided coin when you approach it in a critical way, right? When you don't just think about it as, you know, the miracle of Americanism. So what I would like to do, we've got about 20 minutes. Okay. Before we do the lecture part, I just want to open a question to you. What does something have to be, whether it's a book, a television show, a movie, a music genre? What does it have to be considered a Western? Let's just like talk about it as a class. There are no wrong answers.
Horses.
Horses. I love it.
Indians.
Yep.
Guns.
So guns. I think that's actually fascinating, right? There's a reason that the US for a long time was called Gunslinger Nation.
Well, we
And
still are.
that's what yes, you're exactly right, Georgina. It is definitely part of people. I mean, we are constantly having a conversation about firearms now, right?
Oh boy, yeah.
And part of that, people's complete total dig in reticence to give them up is because they are part of the West, right? What is the Lone Ranger without his 6-shooter? I mean, you think about like, we're going to watch the Twilight Zone episode that we're all going to watch and talk about has to deal with being a sharpshooter, right? A duelist. So when we take away guns, what does that do to the way that we understand ourselves? Not necessarily as a nation today, but this like mythic conceptualization of America. Very interesting stuff, right?
Well, wide open spaces too goes with Westerns.
Mm-hmm.
Free land.
Yep.
virtually free land by the Homesteading Act. I can't remember if it's a Sioux chief or Chief Joseph that said, they made us many promises, more than I can ever remember, but they never kept but one. They promised to take our land and they took it.
Mm-hmm.
I have
And
read,
again and again.
I've
That was
read-
one of my favorite books and movies. I buried my heart at Wounded Knee. And that's
Mhm.
about them. Yeah, that was sad.
Don't tell my 6th grade teacher, but that is one of the only books I ever stole when I was in school. I took it off the shelf and I never gave it back. And at the end, she's like, "Who borrowed this?" I was like, I still have it. Jane, what were you gonna say?
I read, I don't know if it's true, but it sure makes sense. I read that Indian Giver
Mm-hmm.
is about what the US government did.
Yeah, that's true.
Not
Yeah.
Indians or Indian givers.
Huh.
Should we not bring up the fact that Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee was partially plagiarized?
Yes, it was. Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think you have to
Um,
literal Indians for it to be a Western, but you have to have some equivalent of that. Because I think that now I'm blocking on the name. What are those Nathan Fillion 2 space op Westerns?
Firefly and
Fireflies.
Serenity.
Yeah, those are Westerns, and there aren't any
Yeah.
actual Indians. But also there's a
Well, I mean, Star Trek is sort of a Western.
yeah, you're going out into a territory that's unknown to you. It's not really
Yes.
occupied, but it's not your civilization. It's out into a territory that by your past experience is not civilized or is not organized.
I
Mhm.
think there was a
I-
movie called Space Cowboys.
Yeah.
Yes, there was.
There had
And
should have been, but I don't know about it. What,
Tommy Lee Jones was in that movie. My other boyfriend, I love Tommy Lee Jones.
I do too.
I think he's great. One of the things you mentioned, Jane, is a place that is unknown to you, right? The West, and Penny mentioned this earlier, is about individualism, right? It's not about us we think about it as us as a nation now, but a lot of it is about you as a person. Like, what can you become? Can you go into the West and become rich mining gold? Can you become a cattle baron? Can you earn enough money to buy a railroad, right? Or maybe you were, poor in the East and you just want a home of your own, right? The West is about becoming, but on an individual level. So I think it's important to think about that too. Westerns tend to have main characters. And what I mean by that is, like, they tend to have a strong lead. And you guys mentioned this, right? Like, when we were talking about characters that you remembered, you named characters as often as you did actors, right? Like, there's a central player in these stories. They're not really about a community. They're about a person and how they interact with community. And I think that's important to remember too. Like,
Well, and
there's a
also,
number one. Go ahead, Jesse.
force. Force is an element in every one of these. In other words,
Mhm.
either you're shooting somebody, you're dynamiting somebody, you're stealing with the threat of force. It's part of this whole idea that somehow civilization requires you to force yourself into an area that's uncivilized.
And there's something good about, or at least interesting about, the uncivilized space, right? Because a lot of times we think about it as, oh, we're so civilized and then they're savages, or what have you, right? But the Western kind, in some ways, flips it on its head, or at least you're constantly trying to figure out, like, who's civilized, who's savage, and, like, what's good and what's bad. And your point, Jesse, is that there are a lot of dichotomies here, right? Civilization versus savagery, delicacy versus violence, right?
Well, and that in every case where there's a confrontation, it is not solved by morality, by people discussing it and saying, oh, well, yeah, that could be. Instead, it's at the muzzle of a 45.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Well, the
violence.
searchers.
In the Westerns, you
search-
had the good guys
Yep.
wore white hats and the bad guys wore black hats.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it was very unambiguous. You knew who
Yeah.
the good guys were and who wasn't.
And why might that be appealing to know who good guys are and know who bad guys are? Like, why?
Because
Why?
You
fear
don't have
is
to
that,
think about it.
yeah, and fear is at the root of it all. It's the same fear that the caveman felt when he looked out of his cave and didn't know what was out there, but he knew it was fearful, and he
Mhm.
was fearful.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of
I-
that ambiguity is just in The Searchers, the movie with John Wayne
Yeah.
looking for the lost girl. And one of the best recent Westerns I've seen is News of the World with
Oh,
Tom
I
Hanks.
haven't seen that one.
I haven't
Oh,
seen that.
it's very good because he's charged with returning a little girl who was captured and taken by the Indians
Oh, I saw
her,
that.
to her family.
I'll
Who
have to
by
watch
that
that.
turns
Yeah.
out, aren't really very interested in her because she's so different. She keeps, and it parts in trying to get back to the Indians, which is her family by that time.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of the Leatherstocking Tales too, with Natty
Mhm.
Bumppo.
Yeah.
Which I Last of the Mohicans is the most famous of those 5 stories, but it's like the Pioneers, all the 3 others, I don't know. James Fenimore Cooper. Interesting about James Fenimore Cooper, just an aside, his books are thought of as like the very first Westerns, or at least the precursor to the Western genre, at least frontier narratives. And they were popular in the US, but they were massively popular overseas. They like sold out a 20,000 book print run. And they had to, like, it basically had never went out of print in the 19th century overseas. So, as much as we think of the West as an American thing, the appeal of the West is global, right? And in some ways, the West was more appealing for non-Americans while the West was still open, in the sense of like, the English loved them. Like, they loved the American West, could not get enough. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show went overseas to Europe because they were going bankrupt in the US. They literally could not sell tickets in the US because everybody was like, whatever, like, we know the West, we know cowboys, like, what are you trying to do? Goes overseas, does like bang up business overseas, does multiple private shows for Queen Victoria. There's this, they do private shows for the Pope. There's this amazing picture of like Buffalo Bill and some of the native performers in a gondola in Venice. Like, just wild. So when we think about the West, we are talking about it on an American scale in this class, but we can also think of it as a global phenomena for sure. Okay, so here's what I've got on my little list. Westerns have horses, Native Americans, or some kind of equivalent, right? We might even call these the other, right? Somebody other than the hero. Guns, wide open spaces and free land. Territory, you enter a territory unknown to you, so the hero has to go somewhere where they aren't comfortable, or something unknown. There's force and violence to get your way. We don't use our words, we use our actions. There's a dichotomy between civilization and savagery. Civilization is where you start. The West is uncontrolled, untamed, and dangerous. And there's a clear dichotomy between, or a clear divide between good guys and bad guys. Is there anything else that you guys would add to the list?
Yes, cows in Buffalo.
Cows and buffalo. Wildlife, right? I think you're exactly right. In some ways, the land becomes its own character, right? Think about, a lot of you guys have seen Yellowstone. If you haven't, that's okay. The whole premise of Yellowstone is one family trying to keep their ranch. and every other shot is beautiful, right? It's like mountains and rivers and whatever. But the land is actually, when you think about it, a character in and plays a large role in Yellowstone. Without the land, there would be no plot, right? That's what they're fighting over. So,
And most
anyway.
of the houses were made out of wood, whereas back east they were made out of brick.
Yep.
Well,
wanted to
buffalo
say-
chips. But Longmire, the TV series, is a great
Yeah, that's a good one.
depiction of the Western too.
Mhm.
I wanted to say that wagon trains also are. I think that was part of the West, and of so many of them, they had such a problem because to have a wagon train, you obviously had to have a leader, somebody who was in charge. And being there again, these are all pretty self-sufficient individuals, and they thought that they knew exactly what should happen, and maybe the more experienced person actually knew what would happen, but these people were not going to give it up. There, and a lot of times the individual wagon trains would just, like, I'm taking my wagon and I'm going off on my own, and then they would end up dead because they didn't listen to the hero. I mean, they didn't listen to the leader. And so I think the wagon trains had a lot of trouble with staying in line, I guess, following the leader and paying attention to what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, and Penny, I think that also connects to this idea that you are so smartly bringing up of migration, right? The wagon trains are also people moving. There's a lot of movement in Westerns, even when you have like a saloon town, whatever, right? People are very active. Nobody's just sitting around. People are really like doing stuff. And so
And I think they have their
think
own form of law too. I think that the wagon trains, they developed their own, maybe not a formalized law, but they had rules. And like if you stole food from someone, then you were out. You whether you wanted to leave the wagon train or not, they kicked you out. You could not steal supplies and things. And so they developed their own little code of ethics, I think.
Yes. And a lot of people go west because they want to escape codified law, right?
What Was Your Name in the States was a popular song back in the 1850s.
You got to be anybody you wanted to be. There were no background checks. Once you went to the West, you were somebody completely new. And you got to decide your own rules about things. This is why the Mormons settle in Utah, is because polygamy was illegal under the federal government. But in the territories, you could set up your own laws. So they went to the Utah territory and set up this, basically Utah, right? So that they could practice their religion. And then eventually the US sent marshals out there, and they're like, nah, you can't do this. Like, this is still a territory. Like, you can't be doing this. But anyway, there's this idea that in the West, you don't have to behave by social codes. Like, you can be yourself. And if those laws out east don't make sense, we don't have to follow them, right? We march to the beat of our own drum. And so I think that's really interesting to bring up too. Anything else that we want to add before we go on break?
Well, there are a lot of sayings that came from these TV shows that I think we still use today, like wagons ho, and I don't know, just all sorts of things. So,
well, I told Jesse he was bringing up the rear, and that's definitely a wagon train thing.
It is,
right?
Well,
Rustle up some grub.
Circle the wagon.
Ashley,
Circle the wagon.
Ashley, speaking of bringing up the rear, Elizabeth is here.
Elizabeth, I didn't see you. Hey, welcome.
Thank you.
Elizabeth's like, no. I'm being called out.
I was
That's
out
good
driving around looking for North Shiloh Drive.
Oh no.
no.
I hate that for you, but I'm glad you're here now.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
but you're talking about wagon trains. This actually happened to one of my great grandmothers. They were moving in a wagon train, and one of the sisters went off to ride with somebody else, and they all got split up during the day, and that wagon that the sister was on was never seen again, so the sister was never found again.
Wow.
And And there's so many stories like that in the West, right? Because one of the things that is hard for us to imagine, because so much of the world is now settled, is that there was nothing. Like, no one was coming to save you. Nobody even would know where you were. And for some people, I think that was very liberating. But that also seems pretty scary too, right? All right, so let's go ahead and take about a 5-minute break. Stretch your legs. We'll get started again about 2:05, and then we are going to do like breakneck history, so that we are all. I mean, we are gonna fly. So y'all just grab something